Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm reviewing all of Sailor Moon the manga. I did a review of this series before, but I only reviewed half the series and my opinions have changed a little since then, so I decided to do a completely new review. So here it is. So, Sailor Moon, for the few people who aren't familiar with the story of this series, let me just kind of give you a quick rundown of the beginning. So we're introduced to our lead character, Usagi. And Usagi, she's a 14-year-old girl. She's always getting up late for school. Always running out of the house, with breakfast in her mouth. She comes across this cat. And this cat has a bandage on its forehead. She decides to take off the bandage from the cat. And there's actually a kind of a moon shape on the cat's forehead. This cat then tells Usagi that Usagi is a Sailor Guardian. And it is her duty to defend the Earth from evil, to locate the other Sailor Guardians, and to locate the princess. And that is how the story begins. Now, to describe my opinions of this whole series, it's very much easier if I just go into each individual component of the series. So let's start out with the story. The story of Sailor Moon can be broken up into 5 arcs. Each arc of which would get its own season in the anime. But my problem with these arcs is that they're actually very repetitive. There are the little changes, of course, that one would associate with each arc, but overall it's this exact same structure. Basically, Sailor Moon, encounters this new enemy. Her friends encounter minions of the enemy. The minions defeat the friends, or kidnap them, etc, etc. Sailor Moon then, it has this kind of a crisis. She then goes off to the enemy's base or lair or whatever. She fights them, she rescues her friends. The friends fight against the minions again, but win. And then Sailor Moon encounters the big evil and then wins. And that is essentially how most of the arcs go. The end of the actual series, essentially the final arc, is a little different. It's not quite that same structure, but it is very similar-ish. So that repetitiveness I found to be a little grating. Now, there are little changes from arc to arc, and it's those little changes that actually do make some arcs better than the others. For example, I would consider the 3rd arc of Sailor Moon to actually be its best. There's a lot more twists, there's a lot more mysterious characters, there's a lot more battles, etc, etc. Speaking of battles, when it comes to these battles in the story, the characters don't really put up much of a fight in general. They, shout their moves, they attack. When they lose, they hit the enemy once, they fail, and then the enemy strike back and they go down. When they win, they attack, they win. And that's it in general. There are changes, there is actually a very long battle fought at one point in the 3rd arc. But essentially the majority of the battles are very short, so you're not going to go into this looking for action and battles, etc, etc. Now, let's move on to the characters. The characters are the Sailor Guardians, Mamoru, who's a love interest for our lead character Usagi, and the villains. So now let's talk about the characters. So, let's just start out with this. The only characters I actually liked from a development point of view would be Sailor Moon herself, Usagi, and this character called Chibi-Usa. They're actually well developed, their characters change from when they're introduced to, when the series ends. They serve purposes and they are actually kind of charming. Other characters, though, in this series are annoying, completely underdeveloped. They serve a very kind of minor purpose in the overall story. They become kind of interchangeable many of the times. Even the characters that are kind of introduced with a lot of oomph in a particular arc quite often become quite interchangeable later. So, and that is a problem. My biggest problem, though, with this series' characters would be the villains. And that is, okay, as I said in my previous review, I was not familiar with many of the characters from Sailor Moon, and actually the only villain that I was familiar with was Queen Beryl. And so I was disappointed to find out that Queen Beryl was only the villain for the first arc. And each arc has its own villain, but the problem is that quite often we're not given any real information behind their history, why they want to do this, etc, etc. So the characters come off, like the villains come off as very bland, kind of unrelatable, uninteresting. They're just very poorly handled the majority of the time. And essentially also boil down to kind of, big unspeakable evil that, wants to, destroy everything. Which is very bland villain characters, so I was quite disappointed with that. Now, I've been very negative up to this point. I want to point out there is some nice humor in this series. Having reread the first 6 volumes and the 6 volumes that I hadn't read, it kind of surprised me that a lot of what I remembered about the humor in this series are actually kind of very minor points, like they're very sparse. But there are some nice bits of humor. A few bits that actually did make me chuckle. So that's nice. And to move on to the artwork in this series is actually quite gorgeous. If Naoko Takeuchi is a flawed storyteller, she is actually a superb artist. Now, before I actually start discussing the artwork itself in Sailor Moon, I just want to point out this shoujo manga is the most reminiscent to the 49ers that I've seen in general. Now, if you're not familiar with the 49ers, they were a very significant manga group. They kind of established a lot of the tropes, artistic tropes and storytelling tropes that would be used in shoujo. And I have a couple of their manga, The Heart of Thomas by Moto Hagio, Tetera and Andromeda Stories by Kaiko Takemiya. Artistically, Sailor Moon is extremely reminiscent of that. But that isn't necessarily an issue, because their artwork is beautiful. Sailor Moon's artwork is all about, the not using the panels, allowing the images to flow into one another. Detailed hair, detailed character designs, etc, etc. And in fairness, this is a very appealing looking series with some great artwork and character designs. So that always helped to keep me interested. Now, comparing it to the 49ers works themselves, I do find Sailor Moon's art to be a bit lacking. There's a little bit of malformation of, body parts and faces near the beginning of the series. There's a lot more negative, spacing than I would have liked. But the artwork definitely helped me get through the series. Overall, it sounds like I'm, gonna say, don't read this, or don't get it, because, I don't like the story really, I only liked a couple of the characters, and while the artwork is nice and quite beautiful, there are better alternatives. So, why would I recommend this series? To many people, I probably would not recommend you get this at all, or read this at all. But I do want to point something out, and that is, this is one of the most influential magical girl manga, and conversely anime series of all time. And its influence on the genre has been humongous. Now let me explain that. Before Sailor Moon, while there was some, fighting magical girl shows, and, the characters did have to defeat enemies, quite often there was a lot of goofing around, and the characters would just kind of, use their powers for themselves. While Sailor Moon didn't introduce the idea that, the characters would have to defend people and defend the Earth, etc, etc, it very much popularized it. The characters have to, team up, defeat the enemy, go through hardships, troubles, etc, etc, loss. So it very much established a trope, a series of tropes, and tropes that would eventually create a lot of copycats. And of course these copycats, a lot of them were very unoriginal, just kind of Sailor Moon rip-offs. But now, after Puella Magi Magica and subsequently Kill la Kill, which deconstructed that kind of tropes that had been established by Sailor Moon. The magical girl genre is experiencing a kind of revival, and meant much of this revival of, you know, the kind of subverting of the tropes, the establishing of tropes, etc., etc., can be, you know, given back to Sailor Moon. So my personal opinion overall is that if you're not much of a manga collector, don't pick up this series, you know, unless you're particularly into Magical Girl or you like the anime series, etc., etc., or you just like really good artwork and you don't care about the story and characters, then, you know, go ahead, pick up Sailor Moon. But the other reason I'm going to recommend that you possibly pick this series up is because of its historical importance in, you know, not just the genre of Magical Girl, but also of manga and anime as a whole. Now, does that, you know, equate to you wanting to buy the entire series? Probably not, unless you do buy the first couple of volumes and enjoy it. Even though there are 12 volumes in the Kodansha release of Sailor Moon, there are actually 18 volumes in the original Japanese release, and these 12 volumes actually, you know, combine the 18 volumes into 12 volumes. So these volumes are thicker than normal manga volumes, they're a little pricier as can be expected. So essentially this is a long series, and for anyone who's just buying this for a historical, you know, purpose, I wouldn't recommend that you buy the entire thing. Maybe buy the first couple of volumes. Just decide, you know, from that whether or not you think that you want to continue on this series. So yeah, those are the kind of two areas that I'll recommend it on. I haven't been particularly positive on this series. I confess I was kind of bored throughout a lot of it and it was not enjoying it, but I don't regret reading it. And hopefully people can understand why I didn't enjoy this series and won't dislike this video simply because, oh, you know, he's giving Sailor Moon a bad review, etc., etc. Because I do know there's a lot of Sailor Moon fans out there who hate anyone, you know, giving flack to this series. So that's my Sailor Moon review. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you found it informative. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.